Hi, Melissa. Hi, Hunter. Allie. Thanks everybody for being here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started tonight. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Ria, the conservation coordinator here at Swaner, and I use she, her pronouns. And tonight we get to hear from our presenters about their work in the world of wildlife movement, passage, migration, road ecology. And our goal here at Swaner is to preserve, educate, and nurture both the land and our community. And we certainly feel that this topic couldn't hit closer to home for us, and we're really excited to have it tonight. Tonight's talk is part of Swaner's Walks, Talks, and Workshops program, which is a series designed to help everyone engage in nature and the world around us. And we're really excited to co-host this event with Wildlands Network tonight, which is an awesome organization. I am joined by Mackenzie Brown from Wildlands Network here, who's going to help out with the Q&A and anything else that comes up as well.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to say a quick shout out to Swaner for putting on this event. Wildlands Network is grateful to co-host this webinar, and we're really looking forward to this important conversation about road ecology and wildlife movement. Thank you, Rhea.
Great. So an important part of engaging in nature here on the preserve is recognizing that the Swaner Preserve and EcoCenter resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the northwestern band of the Shoshone and the Ute Indian tribe. And in offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. So before I introduce our presenters, I also want to thank Summit County Rap Tax for supporting Swaner's Walks, Talks, and Workshop series, as well as a lot of our other programming. And I just want to go over, we'll get kind of started. So first off, tonight, we're going to hear from Blair Stringham, the DWR's Wildlife Migration Initiative Program Coordinator, and he oversees the movement data of many wildlife species in Utah and uses the data to improve wildlife migration. So take it away, Blair. Yep, there you go.
Hey, so good evening. I'm Blair Stringham. I'm going to just briefly talk about our wildlife migration initiative that we have within the state. So I work for DWR. I've been working for DWR for about 16 years, and so happy to speak to you tonight about wildlife stuff. So as many of you know, Utah's been changing quite a bit over the last decade or more. We're seeing a lot of growth here in the state. That's leading to a lot of unique changes for us as a wildlife agency, as well as for wildlife, how they move across the landscape and how they move back and forth between summer and winter range and things like that. Some of the major concerns we see with population growth is a lot more housing popping up here and there. A lot of this is in winter range or other important habitat for wildlife. We're seeing a lot of energy development with solar, wind, power grids, stuff like that's impacting how animals use the landscape. And then we're seeing just a lot of roads and other infrastructure like that that is impacting animal movements and leading to other sources of mortality and really just impacting habitat. And so a lot of these things are changing how we're looking at wildlife and trying to manage wildlife in the state. And so about 2017, and we had two directors that really saw the vision of mapping out our wildlife habitat and better understanding how wildlife are using the landscapes. And so this was our former director, Mike Dax and Greg Sheehan. And so they created the initiative, which was really just focused primarily around big game species, but it's slowly been expanding into bird species and a variety of other wildlife we'll talk about here in a minute. Around that same time, the Department of Interior put out a secretarial order 3362. And this basically was a funding mechanism for states and other partners to get money, primarily again to look at big game winter range and migration corridors, but it also benefits a wide variety of other species kind of indirectly. This is also a good time where it coordinated a lot of states, land management agencies, and really other partners to start thinking about projects on a more holistic level, looking at how all of us could work together, and it required us to do a state plan to identify priority areas. And so at that time, we started looking around the state, we started putting together groups, and it really became a tool to really bring people together and do more collaborative projects for wildlife. And so within our migration initiative, we've got essentially four main areas where we focus a lot of our efforts. The first one of these is on our populations. This is probably one of the funner things we do. It involves collaring animals, trying to understand their movements. This data comes in, we're realizing we needed a lot of tools to use this data. And so we started developing a lot of things in GIS, our wildlife tracker program, apps, things like that to actually view and use the data. Once we got the data, we started integrating into habitat projects. And so a lot of these involved roadways, it involved habitat treatments to improve habitat, a variety of things like that. And then our outreach component. So we needed to kind of tell this story. It drums up a lot of interest when you start talking about wildlife. And so we put a lot of effort into how we tell those stories. And so I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these. Got a series of pictures here. This is what most of our wildlife captures involve. And so if you've been on any of these big game captures, they're particularly interesting because we oftentimes use helicopters to catch animals. And so this specific examples for deer. And so we have a helicopter that goes out, they shoot a net over animals, they land, they put them in these orange bags, and then they bring back a string of deer essentially underneath the helicopter back to a zone where we do a lot of work on them. And so we get the deer, we attach a GPS unit on it. You can see that doe standing there has one of those GPS collars. You may have seen those. There's a couple thousand of them around the state right now. And we also do some blood work. We look at body condition, we look at pregnancy rates and a variety of other things that help us better understand wildlife health and biology. And then we essentially take off the hobbles, let the deer run away, and then we start tracking them. And what that tracking data looks like is this picture down in the bottom right. Essentially just becomes a lot of dots, but when you blow that up on a map and start looking at how they're moving day to day, it really becomes very helpful for us as biologists to understand how we can be better managers of wildlife. So we created a program called Wildlife Tracker. It's been basically a mapping program, kind of similar to Google Earth, where we can plot out all these points for all these different animals. Currently, we've got about 26 species in Wildlife Tracker, so a lot of big game stuff, a lot of birds as well, things like curlews and cranes. We've got even some amphibians and reptiles, some rattlesnakes, and even fish in there. So we're trying to really understand how lots of wildlife are using the landscape, and it really helps us as an agency to become better stewards of wildlife. This is a little outdated, so we've got over 10,000 animals that are in our wildlife tracker. We've got over 40 million locations. So it's just a plethora of data that really helps us to inform us on a lot of different things. This is just a quick snippet of kind of what that data looks like in Wildlife Tracker. And so we're able to take the dots and kind of see patterns. We've seen this one in the bottom right, that's the deer, just a whole bunch of data points all over the landscape. But as you start looking at it, you start seeing patterns. So this top right picture is a picture of pronghorn out along I-80 in Tooele. You can see that along that interstate boundary, nothing is crossing I-80. So it allows us to see where maybe a roadway in this situation is a barrier to movement of the wildlife. And so that allows us to then start analyzing the situation and trying to find ways to address that problem. The top left, you can't see this very well. This is some moose points along I-80 up Party's Canyon. You can see if you draw a line between them, you can see where it's bouncing back and forth across the interstate. And then we can do some really cool things as we pull it into GIS. That bottom left corner is on the Paunsaugunt, looking at that deer herd migration. There's Highway 89 and there's that line if you can see it. And you can see how the deer move up on top of that mountain and then they basically go down the mountain almost as if you poured water on top, following specific canyons and routes. And so it allows us to map out a corridor and say, okay, this specific drainage or canyon is really important for deer as they move through there. And so we use all these tools to really visualize our data and figure out how we can do better things for wildlife. These are some pictures of actually on the ground projects. The left one is a habitat treatment that we did down in southern Utah. This is a pinyon juniper removal treatment. We went into an area that was just a large stand of monoculture of juniper. We go in and remove that, and you can see that it releases a lot of the grasses and forbs that are in the understory. They come back, it provides just more of a mosaic of different habitat types, becomes really beneficial for wildlife. And this picture on the right is an overhead view of the wildlife crossing in Parties. So right there, close to Park City, you can see a moose crossing this. We've got tons of really cool data of just tons of different wildlife species using this. And so we can use our wildlife tracker data, some other data sets to really pinpoint where these are going to be most effective and get our most bang for a buck as we look at animals and where they want to move across the landscape. And in this situation, avoid a really potential hazard in their movements. Some of the cool resources we have, so we do have a site dedicated to wildlife migration. It's wildlifemigration.utah.gov. A lot of cool projects here. We talk about what crossings are, give you some visuals. So a really good resource if you want to understand more about wildlife migration in Utah. We've got some different blogs that we put out. This one right here I'm highlighting was a really cool one we did on sandhill cranes. There's some really cool maps in there. We've got a really cool animation of showing the crane as it moves in its annual migration. So some really neat resources there if you're interested in checking out our blogs. We also do some YouTube videos. So there's a really neat pelican video that we did that looks at pelican use on the Great Salt Lake and impacts surrounding the airport. And we also do a variety of podcasts as well, talking about wildlife issues. We recently did one on wildlife crossings, which is probably more pertinent to this than anything. So a lot of cool resources, a lot of ways we're just trying to tell this story about wildlife migration and some of the neat things we do and things that I'm sure will be interesting to all of you as well. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Blair. That website, just for anyone that hasn't checked it out, is so cool. There's so much awesome data and maps, and I feel like you could look at that kind of forever. So really awesome. Same with that podcast, really great podcast. We'll send links to this stuff in a follow-up email tomorrow. But I think we'll keep it moving. So next we're going to hear from Nicole Nielson. She is the Wildlife Impact Analysis Coordinator for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And at DWR, Nicole works to avoid and minimize impacts to wildlife, including mitigation projects like wildlife vehicle collisions in Utah. Thanks for being here, Nicole.
Thanks for having me. See if I can get the right screen to share. All right, thank you. So thanks for having me tonight. Really kind of excited to talk about wildlife crossings. I've been with the division for quite a while, not quite as long as Blair. I've been here about 14 years. Most of that was as a habitat restoration biologist in southeastern Utah, where I got to work on a lot of really cool habitat improvement projects. And wildlife crossings is just another way to do habitat improvement for wildlife, to avoid and minimize impacts to wildlife on roadways. Let's see if I can make this work. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, I mean, kind of a similar message as Blair. I mean, Utah is growing. Currently, we have over 3,000 miles of roadways that intersect crucial big game habitats. It's expected to see Utah grow about years. And, that means that there's going to be more roads, more cars on the roads. So we'll probably see more wildlife vehicle collisions unless we start working to minimize those impacts. And crossings can be that way. It can be a tool for us to minimize those impacts. Crossings are really going to be a great way for us to manage wildlife while the state grows. One of the most important parts of any wildlife conservation, in my opinion, is the partnerships. We have Division of Wildlife has a really good partnership with the Department of Transportation, or UDOT. And UDOT's mission is keeping Utah moving. The Division of Wildlife, our mission is to be the trustee and guardian of Utah's wildlife. And so we just really we're working together in a partnership to make sure that we're meeting each of our goals and, keep Utah moving while maintaining healthy wildlife populations. We're also working with other partners, nonprofits, other agencies, private landowners. A lot of roadways go through private lands, and crossings at times, the best place to put them is on private land. So we have to work with all partners, and without one partner, it's just not as successful of a project. And in my former job, I used to use kind of a cheesy line all the time, but I really kind of like it. There's a saying that many hands make light work. Well, many partners make conservation happen. And I just really feel like in the wildlife crossing world, this is partnerships are how we're going to make this happen. And the other part is non-wildlife priority partnerships. I kind of mentioned that UDOT, there's this keep Utah moving, to keep motorists safe, to keep, traffic moving on roadways. And so, kind of recognizing these other priorities as we're kind of looking at wildlife. I think sometimes as the biologist in me wants to think a lot about wildlife, so I have to constantly remind myself that, there's other things out there too, and to bring them into these partnerships. So here's just kind of a look at some of the tools that we use to decide how and where to put crossings and fencing. And so this is just kind of a project that we're working on. So it uses all of our, we have a roadkill collection app that helps us, track roadkill year after year so that we really know where our hot spots are. We use Blair's migration data. We can kind of get crash reports at times, but one of the really useful tools is just having staff on the ground. Division of Wildlife has regional offices with biologists in those areas. UDOT has regional staff. So just being on the ground and understanding where the wildlife vehicle collisions are occurring. You can see these two maps. What we're looking at here is I-80, I-84 in the Echo Junction area. This is a project that it's been in the works for quite some time, it's probably been more than 5 years in the planning. But, we're starting to work towards solutions on this. And you can see we've used the migration corridors to see how these animals move across the landscape, so we know where we'll have the most success when we install crossings and fencing to help funnel these animals to where they need to go. I mean, there's a lot of crucial summer, crucial winter range out there, and we gotta, these animals need these ranges to fulfill all their life cycles. So we got to keep them moving back and forth in these areas. So we use the migration data. That's the orange and yellow map towards the top. And then we also use the roadkill app data to help us really pinpoint where we're having a lot of conflict. So you can see right there on that other map that's kind of blue with some yellow dots on it. And the yellow is where we have a lot more roadkill pickup. And so it really helps us pinpoint the areas where we want and need to do work. And this is a more zoomed in area, that the little black dots, I don't know how well you all can see this on your screen. I see it well on mine, but there's little black dots. And those are the individual roadkill pickups, and that's over a 10-year period of time. We like to look at, where are we seeing this? We want to know over time, is this a reoccurring issue, or was this an incidental fluke, something happened? So we want to look at a long-term data set, and that's where having this data really helps us kind of make these decisions. You can see, we found those hot spots. As part of this bigger project, we're going to start right here at the interchange. And this interchange is really a tough place. You have on and off ramps. You have two interstates coming together into one. There's a railway to the north there. There's the frontage roads. You have trails. You have a river going through there. And, we're going to use a lot of these features, especially that river corridor, as a wildlife crossing. When UDOT improved the interstate years ago, somebody really had a vision and added shoulders to the river crossing, so that if we ever needed to use that as a wildlife crossing, we could. So this is going to allow us to put in fencing and move animals through so they can still, get to the habitats that they need. And these projects they're really expensive, so we had to break this down. You can see that this is a 5-phase project. We're going to start right there at the interchange, so kind of that turquoise green color, and it would really be our anchor point. And right now we only have some funding to start phase 1, and so as a lot of these programs start to come out, we're going to need partnerships to kind of make successful grants so we can get more money. So we're we're just really excited about the partnerships and the ability to mitigate wildlife vehicle collisions. And so this is just kind of a good case study of like what it takes to do a wildlife crossing project. You know, wildlife crossings aren't just for deer, elk, moose, you know, big animals on the roadway. I really love this picture of this tortoise coming through a crossing. To me, it kind of looks like it's running through it, but if you've ever been around a tortoise, they're not real fast. So you can see where there might be some conflict between tortoises and cars. And so down in our southern part of the state, down in the St. George area, we put in crossings for tortoises. You know, we want to get them safely across the road as well, minimize conflict there. You know, and fish, they're important too. A lot of roadways cross streams, and you know, we want to make sure that, you know, there's fish connectivity, that, you know, they can make it from spawning grounds back and forth and meet all of their crucial life stages too. So that's a really important thing that we're working with UDOT on a regular occurrence. As they're doing road improvements, we're reviewing to see if there's, you know, fish passage or other conflicts with wildlife besides just deer, elk, moose, all the big animals. And I just bring up the Migration Initiative website again. A lot of this you can see on there. You can see the fish passages and where they're at. So that Migration Initiative website is a really great one. You know, we're still collaborating on new projects. You know, there's going to be more and more funding opportunities come out. We're working with partners to make sure that happens. You know, we got to keep continuing to improve our mapping. So we got to keep tracking roadkill. Like I showed earlier, these data sets are so important to show a long-term picture, really kind of help us make these decisions. And, you know, we don't have migrations mapped for the whole state. So, you know, we're going to keep supporting Blair as he continues to map more and more areas. And, you know, one thing that we're also focusing on is we have crossings in the state and we have fencing. So we have this infrastructure, but, you know, fencing deteriorates out over time, you know, for various reasons, whether it's a car crash through a fence or, you know, something small through a fence and it kind of gets holes in it. That allows animals on the roadway. So, you know, doing fencing maintenance and asking for, you know, seeking funding to do these maintenance projects, it's really important. I mean, it's like changing the oil in your car. You do it so that that car lasts a long time. And so that's what we want to do with these fencing projects. We want to make sure they last a long time. And so that's really what the Division of Wildlife is doing on crossings. And I just want to kind of make a shout out to all of our partners that we've worked with. If I started trying to name them, I definitely would miss them because there's just so many important partners in making this happen. And gosh, I'm really thankful for all of them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I definitely echo that, and partners making conservation work happen. We definitely could not do a fraction of what we do without our awesome partners, some of which I see in the audience tonight. So thanks for joining. So lastly, but not least, we are going to hear from Michael Dax, the Western Program Director for Wildlands Network. And he's located in South Fork, Colorado. Cool, thank you.
And my screen is successfully sharing?
Yep, you are all good.
Okay, awesome. So I'll just do a quick introduction first, since Wildlands Network is not as well known as the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. But we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in Salt Lake City, with staff spread out across North America, in both the US and Mexico. And our focus is connectivity. And before I jump into my presentation, I just want to make kind of a quick distinction between, you know, what we generally, you know, there's a large focus on crossings and roadways, but as Blair pointed out in his presentation, there are other barriers to wildlife movement as well. And I'm going to focus mostly on what different states are doing in the policy realm. And my talk is going to mostly focus on crossings and road ecology, and not as much on, kind of everything else: fences, energy development, residential development, etc. But all those issues are just as, if not more important than roadways. All right, so I'm just going to kind of run through what different states are doing, because I think there's a lot of really good work happening across the country, especially in the Western United States. And every state is kind of taking a slightly different approach that I think all provide good opportunities and good examples to follow. So in Wyoming, Wyoming in many ways has kind of been the poster child of connectivity. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Path of the Pronghorn, a documented pronghorn migration that goes from south of Jackson, Wyoming to southern Wyoming, near the Utah border. And following that documentation, a lot of work that has taken place to protect that migration. In 2020, Governor Gordon issued an executive order that designated 3 additional wildlife corridors and created a process to designate additional ungulate corridors. And there's an important distinction there where, elsewhere, as Blair pointed out, we have documented wildlife corridors, but they have not been designated. So in Wyoming, the designation follows certain restrictions, as well as frees up money for private landowners to do restoration or improvement on fences and things like that. Last year, the Wyoming legislature invested $10 million in its Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust Fund that is dedicated to for crossings. So the Watershed Restoration Initiative in Utah is a very comparable program to the Natural Resources Trust Fund. And so in addition to all the other money that is in that program to support other kinds of restoration, there's money dedicated for wildlife crossings, to support wildlife crossings. And that's important because these projects are very expensive, as all transportation projects tend to be. So to help pay for that, Wyoming has adopted a couple different strategies. Teton County, which is where Jackson, Wyoming is, Grand Teton National Park, and the southern gateway to Yellowstone. Voters approved a special purpose excise tax of $10 million. Here, I think it's unique, although, potentially Summit County in Utah and Park City is not totally dissimilar, where wildlife is a huge part of the Jackson economy. Wildlife tours are, and wildlife viewing are a reason that people come to visit Jackson. So the idea of taxpayers in that county supporting wildlife crossings with a special purpose excise tax, there does seem especially appropriate, whereas maybe other places across the West, there's not as good of a match. I would think that perhaps Summit County is one place where you could potentially make that argument, where there's a good match there as well. Additionally, I guess I took this part out, but Wyoming also created a license plate to support wildlife crossings. And so far, over 2,400 license plates have been sold. What's kind of interesting about this license plate is it's a $180 application fee, which is quite high as far as many specialty license plates are concerned. But it has generated over $500,000 so far. And then last fall, Wyoming entered a formal partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to support voluntary conservation of migration corridors on private land. So kind of following up and in a similar vein to Governor Gordon's executive order, Wyoming, with this partnership, unlocked additional funding for private landowners to take actions like modifying fences so that they're more wildlife friendly. This is a program that we would love to see extended to other states, potentially Utah, and those discussions are ongoing. But that was definitely a really exciting development that we saw last year. Colorado, another leading state. So in 2019, there was an executive order followed by additional legislative action in 2021. Also in September of 2021, stemming from that executive order, Colorado Parks and Wildlife released its big game policy report and had a big game policy report that I believe that report is about 60 pages, if I remember correctly, and there is a long list of different policy ideas around improving big game connectivity that would be applicable to Utah or pretty much any state. And slowly now, Colorado is beginning to take on some of those ideas that were developed as a part of that report. And one thing that that report focuses on that I think is especially pressing are the growing impacts of recreation. I think we, especially since the pandemic or during the pandemic and since then, we've seen growing recreation across the country, especially in the Western US, people getting outside to hike, mountain bike. You know, of course, places like Moab have been seeing that for ages. And this does have an impact on wildlife. There was a study around Vail, Colorado, a couple of years ago that showed declining elk calf survival due to high human recreation. So that's, you know, something that is certainly growing as a concern, and that's one of the areas that that policy report focuses on. Then last year, Colorado's legislature approved SB 151, which created a dedicated fund to support wildlife crossings and put an initial $5 million in that fund. So what's especially interesting and significant about this development is transportation projects take a long time to develop and implement. Nicole just showed in her presentation the project around Echo Junction having 5 phases. And those 5 phases are in recognition of the fact that these things are expensive and they take a long time to implement. And so many, for most states, when money is appropriated, that money is available either for a single fiscal year or maybe 3 years or maybe 5 years. But at a certain point, that that money would then revert back to the general fund. By creating a dedicated fund, that money will always be available and earmarked for wildlife crossings, as well as maintenance of wildlife crossings, studies, conservation easements to protect the conservation value of land on either side of a wildlife crossing, staffing, design. So pretty much every aspect that goes into one of these projects. Of course, all that being said, that $5 million was very quickly allocated. And so that fund has pretty much been spent down. But with that fund created in future years, Colorado can just appropriate money into it as opposed to having to go through a whole policy discussion again. New Mexico has a long history of legislative initiatives, mostly memorials surrounding wildlife crossings. And then in 2019 passed the Wildlife Corridors Act, which directed New Mexico Game and Fish and New Mexico Department of Transportation to develop a wildlife corridors action plan, which they finalized last July. It's a 700-page report. It includes a whole host of information and data in there, but of most significance is 11 priority safe passage projects that were identified, both based on wildlife vehicle collisions as well as the needs of habitat connectivity. So one thing that New Mexico did that was really significant is that their priority crossing locations are not just based on wildlife vehicle collision data. They recognize that in some places, and I think Blair showed those pronghorn on I-80 as a perfect example, that a road could be such a barrier that animals aren't even attempting to cross, which means, from a purely, a data standpoint like that, there are no wildlife vehicle collisions, so you might not see a problem. but clearly there is one. And that data that Blair showed was a perfect example of that. So in the New Mexico plan, 6 projects are based on the needs of habitat connectivity, and 5 projects are based on wildlife vehicle collision data. Last year, New Mexico appropriated $2 million to support this plan. In this year, there's a bill modeled off the Colorado bill from last year to create a dedicated fund. The initial ask was for $50 million. Currently, New Mexico has $5 million in the budget. And just yesterday, that bill passed off the Senate floor and is now going to go over to the House and has about 20 days before the end of the session to make it across the finish line. California, 2 years ago, appropriated more than $61 million to support wildlife crossings. By far, the most amount of money that any state has dedicated to wildlife crossings. And then last year, passed a bill, the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, that had a number of different components to it. But one of them that's most significant was authorizing Caltrans to implement wildlife crossings as standalone projects. Most frequently across the country, wildlife crossing projects are not done on their own. It's usually when there's other construction planned that they go in, that the biologists for both the transportation agency as well as the wildlife agency will say, okay, we're doing some other we're doing some other work here. We're, replacing a bridge, we're expanding a lane. Are there some wildlife considerations here that we should also include? So the fact that in California, the bill specifically authorizes the state to do wildlife projects as just wildlife projects is a big deal, as far as kind of refocusing what's really driving these projects. Because in the current model, it's not always the places with the greatest need, but the places where other construction happens to be happening. Oregon passed a very similar bill as New Mexico that same year. And then last year appropriated $7 million to implement that plan. And this year has another $5 million in the budget to do the same. And then Nevada, just to the west, another executive order in 2021. It had multiple components. It had a sage grouse and sagebrush habitat component, and then additionally a wildlife connectivity plan. One of the components of that was increasing NDOT's role in habitat conservation. Nicole had mentioned that for UDOT and most transportation agencies, their job is to get people from one place to the other. Most places, most states, transportation agencies are extremely focused on kind of a more traditional take on what transportation is and what their role is. And this executive order explicitly increased NDOT's role in the conservation side of their mission. And then finally, saving the best for last. In 2020, Utah's House unanimously passed HCR 13, which was a resolution expressing support for wildlife connectivity and crossings. That same year, resulting from that resolution, the Utah Connectivity Working Group formed, and I know there are a number of members of that group on the call tonight, in addition to DWR, a group that meets regularly to discuss various projects and initiatives happening around the state so that they are as coordinated as possible. Then last year, the legislature appropriated $1 million for a crossing project on I-84, that exact area that Nicole was discussing earlier around Echo Junction. It also, the legislature also unanimously passed HB 427, which was sponsored by Rep. Doug Owens, which added wildlife connectivity as part of an annual report that DOT submits to the legislature each year, saying what it's done, what it's planning to do. So this creates some additional transparency and accountability for what UDOT is doing around crossings. And then finally, and most excitingly, there is currently $20 million in the budget, in Utah's budget, for crossings. And I was actually supposed to be doing this webinar tonight from my hotel room in Salt Lake City, but due to the snow yesterday, I did not make it. But talking to some colleagues who did, and having conversations with the governor's office, with Representative Schultz and Representative Owens, everyone feels very strongly that that money is going to make it through. There's just about a week left in the legislative session, and nothing is final until it's final. But we feel really confident that when that final gavel strikes, that $20 million will still be in the budget. And that will be the second most amount of money that a state has appropriated for wildlife crossings after California. So that would be a huge deal if that makes it through. And the timing could not be better. In the 2021 infrastructure bill, the federal infrastructure bill, it created a new program, a wildlife crossings pilot program with $350 million to be dispersed to states through competitive grants. That project or that program will require a 20% match, meaning the $20 million that is currently in the budget could leverage an additional $80 million to bring to Utah to complete projects like the one Nicole was discussing before. So we are, of course, extremely excited that Utah is, really taking the reins and is going to be an example for other Western states of, what stepping up really looks like. And that is all I have.
Thank you so much. That is so exciting. That is a huge chunk of change coming down the pipeline that would just make a giant difference. So that's really exciting. We'll see what happens in the next week and keep our fingers crossed. And I think we'll kind of open it up to questions for our whole panel here. I have a couple of questions to start us off, and I see a couple coming through already. I think maybe all of you shared photos of the Parley's Wildlife Bridge, which is obviously near and dear to our community's heart. It's close to Park City. It's also really, really visible. And I think well advertised, at least of what it is. People know what it is, it's visible. I'm wondering how many crossings are around the state that people probably don't know what they are or never noticed them or not quite as visible, because I'm assuming most of them are not quite as visible as that one.
I think maybe I could take a stab at that one. I mean, I went to school at Southern Utah University. So I traveled down I-15 a lot. I drove through Beaver, and there's a crossing there, and it's maybe not as aesthetically pleasing as the one in Parley's, but for a long time I was like, this is in the middle of nowhere. Why would they have a human, walkover bridge? And once I started studying wildlife, that was one of the first crossings that they pointed out that Utah had. So Utah has done other overpasses in the past, this maybe not as aesthetically nice. And so to me, that was kind of a surprise. But you can find on the Migration Initiative website, there's a map of crossings. I can't remember how many we have in the state. Some of those are not, it's a kind of a data set to allow us to track, even like car underpasses that maybe wildlife is using that we want to, improve, maintain, anytime something comes up. So not all of them maybe have been put in for wildlife, but wildlife may use them. So yeah, you can check that out on the Migration Initiative website.
I will throw that in the chat when I find it. But yeah, very, very fascinating. Like crossings like that tortoise that you showed, Nicole. Are there tortoise specific crossings that are much smaller than I think people are aware of. I want to kind of rewind. A couple of you mentioned the new roadkill app, which just rolled out, and I kind of want to highlight that a little bit more. Rose asked, is the roadkill app available for the general public?
Yes, I can tackle that one. It is. So it's in both the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. It's called the Roadkill Reporter app. So if you search for it, it usually is the first thing to pop up. It allows anybody to download it on your phone, and you can immediately start reporting animals that you see along the roadways. It becomes really helpful for us because we can plot that data and really find hotspot locations as locations of animals start to build up in a specific area. We can start tackling them. So yeah, we ask that everybody download that, get involved, start reporting things. There is an expectation, I think, that when you report it, it'll be picked up immediately. That's not necessarily the case. Some of the roadways, especially the major roads, are contracted with people that will drive them a couple times a week. So depending on when you report it, it might sit there for a couple days. Some of the more rural roads in the state, it might sit there for a couple weeks. So be patient with us. Some of the roads, we may not ever pick it up if they're really rural, but it is data. Everything you submit does come to us and we'll use in some way. So it'll be helpful regardless of, I guess, the end result of the animal. But
I just put at least the Apple Store link to it, and I've got it on my phone. I've submitted a couple of roadkill sightings, and it's really simple. You can add photos, and so this is just a really great opportunity for citizen or community science, like crowdfunding. You're going to be getting information from all over the place, which I know Rose, who asked the question, is involved in a lot of community and citizen science. So this is another fun way to contribute to this data, and I'm sure it's really, really helpful and just rolled out. So it's brand spanking new for everybody to download and get comfortable with.
Looks like we have a follow-up question from Melissa as well. She's asking if you can add past roadkill observed prior to the app.
I remember, I think, so I'm pretty sure when you are reporting a location, so you'll open the app, you'll click on the button down the bottom, and you can report the location. And so it doesn't actually map like where you're specifically at. You can go back and mark the location. Let me check real quick. I'm pretty sure you can set the date as well. So let me just verify that. Yeah, so you can do the day as well. So you could go back and backtrack all those as well. So yeah, that'd be great.
And there's a lot of species on there. So all kinds of small to large, the large ungulates, but also snowshoe hares and smaller things as well. So if you see it and you are able to, if you're not driving, or you could wait till you get to your destination, able to report that. Are you seeing any of that data so far, or is that yet to come to you?
Yeah, so we've been looking at it for a little while now, probably 2 or 3 months that we've been collecting it. Some of the spots we were aware that were big locations like Echo Junction. That's been particularly bad this year. If anybody's driven through there, there's been a lot of deer and elk hit there. I mean, 5 to 10 probably per night. So it's been a big hot spot. Other spots are kind of rising to the top that we didn't really know about. So it's been really helpful both in terms of documenting, locations that we knew were critical, as well as highlighting some new ones.
Wow, that is awesome to kind of fill in those data gaps that you didn't know existed. And that's why I love community or citizen science so much. It's like you can't be everywhere at once, and so you enlist the public's help and you get all the data you could ever want.
This year's been particularly helpful too, just because we haven't had this much snow for 5 to 10 years. So it really kind of highlights where those real critical areas are during really severe winters, which is generally when we see the most animals on roadways as well. So it was, I guess, good timing to roll it out prior to the massive amount of snow we got.
Yeah, that definitely ties into Sally asked the question about record snowfall this year. There's a ton of snow. There's a ton of snow out my window that does not have a view anymore. And it's just a wall of snow. But Sally would imagine that there is that elk and deer are struggling and don't have enough food. And so what kind of things is DWR doing about this? And maybe what kind of effects are you seeing if you go into a little more detail?
Blair, do you want to take that one or do you want me?
Yeah, I didn't want to monopolize all the questions, but I'm
Well,
happy to take a stab.
You might be better at answering that since you are in the wildlife section. You might have a few more details than I do.
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, so we monitor our, primarily our big game herds on a weekly basis throughout the winter. We look at a series of things like temperature, snow depth, access to food, a few things like that. For the most part, our animals across the state are doing all right. The exception to that is up in Cache County, Rich County. Snow depths up there have been really deep, and particularly Rich County. I mean, some of those areas where deer are at are like 3 to 4 feet deep. And so we have started feeding deer up in that location. We've assessed a couple other locations around the state as well. Going back to the Echo Junction, one of the really interesting things we've been doing there, we had about 30 elk get hit on the roadway within like a week time frame. And that's really scary for us just because, I mean, a deer causes quite a bit of damage, but elk are just so much bigger that they can often lead to more deaths of humans as well when they hit them. And so we started feeding elk off of that site to try to pull them off the roadway. And we're successful in pulling the elk away from the roadway to a feeding site. So that wasn't necessarily just to try to keep the animals to survive through the winter. I mean, it was, I guess, for roadway stuff, but it was more a public safety thing just to get them off the roadway. So we utilize it in a variety of situations. But yeah, overall, deer are still doing okay. That's yet to be determined. Usually about April timeframe is kind of our worst period. And that's when a lot of the snow's melting. They have access to food again, but the plants start greening up. And at that time, as animals start switching from a diet of largely shrubs to green grass again, they need a little time for their stomachs to digest and break down that green content. And during that time, a lot of animals actually starve to death just because their bacteria in their stomach can't keep up with the nutritional needs that they have at that time. So we keep monitoring it, but right now, as of February 23rd, things are generally okay still. So
we'll keep an eye out for that. I posted another link in the just chat here of our local radio station, KBCW, reminding people not to feed wildlife from DWR. So everybody take a listen to that and read more about kind of what we should leave it to the professionals.
Acknowledging that wildlife vehicle collisions aren't specific to Utah, Melissa has a question about the roadkill reporting app and is curious if anybody has knowledge if something like that exists in other states, such as California.
I know Montana has an app, but that is the only state that other state that I'm currently aware of. But yeah, but my knowledge only means so much on that point.
That's a good question. I know that also that the iNaturalist app, if anyone's familiar with that, it's like a community science submitting of sightings of all things that will take dead animals as well. And sometimes you can submit that species to a certain project. So if it's a bird, you can submit it to a certain, like if you guessing that it is roadkill, you can submit it to certain projects. So that could be a way, if an app like this doesn't exist in your state, that could be a way to contribute to data. And sometimes researchers will pull from that data pool. I see a question from Andrew about, or more of a comment. I would support a dedicated license plate for Utah that provides funding for these endeavors. Is there a license plate that supports DWR?
there are a couple of license plates out there with wildlife on them. They don't necessarily go directly towards any like migration type projects, but you may have seen, so I think there's one at the Peregrine Falcon, like an elk, I don't know, a bunch of other animals, but yeah, they do have money that comes back to us. Some of that money goes directly to our non-game species as well. So yeah, that is helpful for us as from a funding source. We don't get a ton of money from it, but it is available.
Well, you can wrap that on your license plate. I know some of the Swaner staff has some of those.
Andrew also had another question. He's curious if there's a way that the general public can be informed or better informed of what the major hotspots are and when they come up for funding, or or that there is a shortage of funding needed. For example, maybe a change.org petition.
I think that is a good question. Right now we kind of have a collaborative that Wildlands actually, I guess Wildlands is a participant, but they're not the one hosting it. That is Utah Wildlife Federation. And so there is a wildlife connectivity group that, meets, I don't know, monthly or so. I'm not sure what the schedule is. I just know that it pops up on my calendar and I go to it. So it's an opportunity. I mean, it seems like the public is invited. I think if you're interested in that, I can get the information that could then be passed out if people want to join that meeting.
And then I was going to add that last year UDOT put out a wildlife vehicle collision hotspot report, identifying a number of the hotspots in the state. I tried to quickly Google it, but of course all the results on Google are now about the app, and I can't find the report quickly anymore. But I'm sure we can put that in the follow-up email.
Yeah, we'll send some of these resources out in the follow-up tomorrow. Michael, maybe a question for you from Jennifer. Should we write our legislature about Utah's upcoming wildlife bill, or in wildlife crossings, wildlife in general?
Yes, please do. The legislative session is only going for a week more, and please email or call your legislator and tell him or her that you support the appropriation for wildlife crossings. And we feel very confident, but it always helps for legislators to hear more voices, especially their constituents.
Great, thank you. I had one more question, Blair, for you. I think, what kinds of data gaps has the migration initiative been able to fill? I mean, it's been so much data, so I'd imagine a lot of data gaps and a huge flood of data that you didn't have before. But are there any in particular that's really helped to kind of get information on that where there wasn't information before?
Yeah, probably the biggest one is migration corridors. That's been mentioned a few times. If you want more information about that, you can go to our migration website, and we actually have most of the state mapped now for most of our deer migration corridors. But that was one thing that we had biologists that have been around forever, and they see things on the landscape and felt like we had a pretty good idea of where deer were moving, particularly between like summer and winter range. But we were able to fact check that with GPS collars. And so most of those were fairly accurate, but we found that some deer were moving a lot farther than we anticipated. We found that some of the North Slope deer, so kind of south of Wyoming along Highway 150, the Mirror Lake Highway, some of those deer were essentially going east almost to Colorado and then down to Vernal to winter. And so we've been able to find some really cool information like that is really helpful for us, because we had no clue those deer would have gone that far. We just assumed they kind of would have went to Echo Junction or Evanston. So yeah, each year, honestly, each day when we color an animal, sometimes we find out really cool stuff. Sometimes they're kind of boring, but it's a fun job because you never quite know what you're gonna get.
I might just add to that, where I was a habitat restoration biologist. That data that Blair and his team were collecting, it really kind of helped us hone in projects and understand how to do them better for wildlife. So that data has just been so useful in all of our programs at DWR.
Yeah, one of the coolest things we're working on right now, so it's probably going to come out in the next month, is a story on mountain lions. And we've been collaring quite a few along the Wasatch Front. And we had one particular female which had gone basically from the Provo area north up into Wyoming. It crossed Flaming Gorge, it swam across there, went back into Utah, went into Colorado, and ended up dying west or east of Denver. So it was probably one of the longest migrations that's ever been documented for a mountain lion. She went over about 1,000 miles. So we find some of these animals that just do incredible things, and it's just awesome stories. And so watch for that in the next month or so. It should be one of our blog articles.
Wow, that's incredible. I am excited to read that. That is awesome. We've got definitely some other questions rolling in. Rose said, are any particular species that you wish we had more data on? Then maybe these data gaps still exist.
Maybe I'll take the first try at that one. You know, we do have a lot of migration or missing migrations. And I think that will really kind of, as we color more and more, you know, our big, large ungulates and understanding their movements, I think that'll really help in the crossing world. You know, as I kind of said in my presentation, Utah it's growing, and it's anticipated to grow a lot in the next not too long. So yeah, I think as we continue to fill in, you know, all of these migrations statewide, that'll be a huge deal for us. So for me, yeah, I just wish we had them everywhere. So I knew, well, not I, the team that I work with knew where to put wildlife crossings and where that was important.
Tatiana has an interesting question. They're asking where we can see bills about wildlife crossings, if there's a specific website that tracks this. I just wanted to mention a resource that Wildlands Network recently put together about bills related to wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity that have been introduced this year. So I'll drop that in the chat. And I also want to see if Michael or anyone else had any other resources to track the bills about wildlife crossings.
Yeah, I think that's the best resource at the moment, Kenzie.
You know, this isn't about, you know, legislation, but Blair and I do talk to our counterparts in other states to kind of get ideas on what they're doing. So we're trying to work with other state wildlife agencies just to make sure that, you know, we're not missing something. And I did mention our roadkill app to Blair and I's counterpart in Colorado, and she was quite interested in that app. So Blair's gonna get an email soon. so yeah, I mean, on top of legislation, we are trying to communicate with our surrounding states.
Yeah, we find that wildlife really don't respect state boundaries or any boundaries for that matter. And so we're finding that a lot of our populations will cross into states or even multiple states. And so, yeah, a lot of level of coordination has to occur above and beyond just Utah. And a lot of these populations, they will winter in one state and summer in another. And so again, it's a constant dynamic that's changing. And as we learn more, it creates a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, and I should mention, and I see Melissa, one of our impact analysis biologists on this meeting tonight, but she's working with Idaho to kind of work on some projects in that part of Utah and Idaho. So yeah, we're always trying to work with other states because yeah, wildlife doesn't respect boundaries.
If they had to deal with the paperwork, maybe they would, but not this time. Kind of a local question, Sally asked, so Highway 224, which runs from I-80 into Park City and the preserve is right next to it, had a recent speed limit reduction from 55 to 45. And do we know if that's helped wildlife at all or roadkill? Like, do we have any data on that? Do we know?
I'm not sure that we know much at this point. I mean, some of the information that we have found in other areas, you know, it's kind of kind of a mixed bag of information. So yeah, I don't have a real good answer for that. I mean, Blair, Michael, do you guys have something?
Yeah, I would add that I think in general they tend not to have a huge impact. I think what is potentially interesting here, and also another road, State Route 9 east of Zion National Park, that could be interesting, is where you have a lot of tourist traffic. I think there's opportunities for them to be more effective in places where it's your everyday commute. You know, there are roads that I drive on every day. I could not tell you what the speed limit is because I've been driving it for years and I just go the speed that I go. And, if they, reduce the speed limit, I might not even notice. Whereas, a place that does have tourist traffic, and of course, 224, I think is an interesting example where you have both daily commuters as well as tourists. I think, tourists who are seeing the speed limit for the first time are more likely to respect a new speed limit. So I think there's, potential for speed limit reductions to be more effective in those instances. But as you might imagine, swapping out some signs tends to be a lot cheaper than other solutions. So it's, it's something that can be done. But certainly monitoring is always important, whether it's, a speed limit reduction, an overpass or an underpass. So we have hard data on these actions.
Yeah, definitely. The tourists versus the locals. Maybe we need a state psychologist to weigh in on this and figure out what's the most effective. Just kind of while we're on the subject of 224, Swaner is really excited to announce that Save People, Save Wildlife has donated 2 large metal reflective wildlife sculptures that we're going to be placing on the preserves. This is the first time I've announced that anywhere. We'll be sharing some photos and information about that, but we're really thankful, really excited to see those go up on the preserve and not only be an art piece, but raise awareness for wildlife crossings, to pay attention for wildlife, especially on the busy 224. So there's going to be a couple more of those in the Park City area, but we're excited to get those out, and we'll share more information on that in the coming weeks.
We have a very interesting question from John that I think we could probably spend the rest of our time discussing, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. He asks, as Utah's roads or homes continue to encroach on animals' grazing and migratory patterns, when do we halt urban sprawl in order to protect animals' food and water sources, as well as protect native and endemic plant species to ensure we have enough water for everyone in the severe drought we're in?
An easy question.
Very easy.
John, we'll just get, you can hop on video and we'll loop you in here. A lot of pieces in that, a lot of things that Utah's dealing with, that all our communities are dealing with, that the West is dealing with: growth, drought, water.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a really important issue and a really hard question to answer. I have, said for a while that I think, county zoning has kind of been the third rail of connectivity. I think it's something that, we recognize is a growing issue. But most of what we've talked about between all of us tonight has been not regulatory, has been voluntary, has been proactive. I think, when it comes to placing restrictions, that will certainly, most likely come at a county level. And so, that would be, up to you to, either talk to, your city councilors, your county commissioners, whatever it may be. I think there are also opportunities to, proactively work with developers, especially in places where there are documented wildlife corridors. I think there are other interesting examples as well. I saw a photo of a subdivision in Driggs, Idaho, which is kind of a suburb of Jackson, Wyoming in ways. And it was interesting that the houses were built and clustered in a way that allowed there for farming to continue, for open space to kind of maximize open space as part of this subdivision. So I think there are ways to kind of get creative when space begins to be limited. And I think there's also opportunities. There's a community near Santa Fe where half of the land is residential development, and then the other half of the subdivision is managed as open space, as trails. So I think it's certainly something where I think we have to get creative. I think we have to kind of think up new solutions that haven't really been necessary before. But as more and more people come to the Western US, to retire, for lifestyle reasons or whatever, these are issues that we're certainly confronting and are becoming more and more urgent. As far as the water question goes, I think that I won't even touch that. That's a far more complicated question.
We've got a good example of kind of one city we've worked with in Utah to kind of address this issue of growth as well as wildlife needs. And that's in Eagle Mountain. And so if you go to our Migration Initiative website, there's kind of a write-up on this that kind of gives more details. But we found that a lot of our deer were coming off of the Ocher and Stansbury ranges, and essentially migrating right through what is Eagle Mountain proper to get to the south end of that valley to winter. And so we've been working with them. They put in a crossing structure and some fencing and a system that essentially starts flashing as soon as animals approach a roadway. And so it's helping to reduce vehicle collisions in that area. And Eagle Mountain also put in essentially a migration corridor into their master plan that's going to preserve open space right through the middle of Eagle Mountain to allow the deer to migrate right through the city. So there's not a lot of examples out there yet, but we're hoping like momentum will grow with cities to start thinking about wildlife. A lot of our migration initiative data can probably feed in to help them identify where is important within their cities. So hopefully in the future, there'll be a lot more projects like this will allow us to work with them to hopefully make things okay for wildlife and human population growth. Because I guess the short answer to this question is we probably can't stop most of it, but if we can find ways to work together, it's definitely more beneficial than just letting it happen and not trying at all. So.
And maybe to continue on with that. So the other thing that we do in the impact analysis program is, we have biologists in each of our 5 regional offices that work with industry and developers to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts from, developments or industrial, projects that is we can work with them to avoid and try to mitigate these problems. We're also, trying to build a tool. I mean, hopefully it'll be done in a few years. I mean, funding is always the limiting factor. You see all these cool tools that we're building, and money's not always at a surplus. So, but one of the hopes would be that developers and industry could use this tool to then kind of understand what wildlife's there and what kind of things they can do to minimize impacts from their potential projects on wildlife. So hopefully we can find funding. If people have ideas, please send it my way.
Thanks, guys. That was definitely a loaded thing. But yeah, like you said earlier, Nicole, partnerships, not only between conservation organizations, but cities and counties and developers and all of these people, all of these stakeholders coming together to make these really creative solutions happen is awesome to see. I think we'll do a couple more questions and wrap up. So if you have a burning question, put it in the Q&A. Chad asked, is signage used very much? Which I think we've touched on a little bit with like those flashing lights that you were talking about, flashing signage and speed.
If I could,
yeah.
If I could just answer that a little bit more. So, of course, there's signs that are just always there that are static signs. I think, those tend to, not be terribly effective. Again, for, motorists who pass those every day, it quickly becomes background noise. In other places where there are electric signs put out, that say like wildlife crossing, there have been studies that have shown that if those are used seasonally, that they can be effective. So, during, spring or fall during migration, when animals are moving up or down and, a roadway all of a sudden becomes in the path of that corridor, putting out a sign for that, for those points of the year, whether it's a couple weeks or a month or something like that, that tends to be much more effective. And then some of this technology is, getting even more interesting. And I don't know, I know that at Eagle Mountain, there's discussion of putting in one of these animal detection systems where at the end of 8-foot tall exclusionary fence, there's actually a pad that wildlife are forced to walk on. And then that triggers lights to flash when wildlife are in the roadway. And so that's, kind of a real time warning system as opposed to just lights that are kind of always flashing. I don't know if there's a ton of data on that, but those tend to, hopefully be more effective.
Yeah, and that is in the works of being installed right now. Like, because I have done so many projects, like every project, it's always a little behind. So, but that is in the works right now.
Awesome. That's exciting. Yeah, great question. I definitely see that effect with signs, like if they're static and stationary and asking you to pick up your dog's poop or something like that, it's not always super effective. So some of these like creative solutions that tap into how people think are much more effective.
Looks like John has another question here. He mentions that he's researching urban conservation efforts and having green corridors to bring back plant and animal diversity. Are there any current projects that are designed with native plants as the highlight to ensure ecological preservation?
I guess maybe I'll try to answer that. If we're talking about crossing projects, no, probably not. But yeah, there's a lot of work going on out there, for habitat restoration. A lot of them do have a focal point on native species being planted. So yeah, I mean, you could definitely check out the Watershed Restoration Initiative or wri.utah.gov. And that's a, all kinds of partnerships there of projects that are happening. I don't know if there's a good way to sort out which ones are, native plant based, but yeah, there's a lot of partnerships happening out there for, native wildlife. The plant part I'm not as well versed on, but I do know there's a lot of projects out there that, the priority is to seed native species.
And this particularly comes into effect when we have like large scale fires and stuff like that. And so if you think back the last couple of years where we've had like these 50 to 100,000 acre fires, a lot of times we'll go in immediately and reseed that, and that's almost entirely native species. So yeah, as Nicole mentioned, the Watershed Restoration Initiative does a lot of that work.
Well, yeah, we'll throw that WRI link in the follow-up too. There's so many awesome projects that just contain everything from stream restoration to native plants to, I mean, anything you can think of in there. There's really cool partnerships and creative things going on. And I think we've kind of worked through our questions. So I think we are going to wrap up tonight. And I want to give a huge thanks to all our panelists. Thank you so much for your Thursday evening. Thank you for lending your expertise and sharing this information. We're just really thankful to have you to share with our community. Thanks to Wildlands Network for co-hosting this event and all the work that they do. And thanks to all our attendees for showing up and really great questions and participating. We appreciate you and hope this was helpful, and hope to hear your feedback, and you'll receive some links tomorrow. Thanks, Sally. Sally says thank you. So thanks, everyone. All right, well, I think I'll end it unless anyone has any last words.
I'll just say thanks for the opportunity to let us present on some programs that we're really proud of at the Division of Wildlife.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about the fun things we get to do, especially like in a format like this. And the migration stuff, I think, is only gaining momentum. So hopefully this will help to spur that and lead to results like Michael talked about, and more cool project for us to do. And so it's good. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much for all the work you do. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming out, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks. Have a good night.
Right?
You guys too.
Thanks for
See ya.
having.